Thanks for coming back from the strong coffee and beautiful sunshine outside the second panel. And for the first panel, we cover the themes of curating and collecting both in public institutions and private sectors. And second panel will focus on the other two themes, research, criticism, and writing. And I'm very pleased to introduce the moderator for the second panel, Professor Zheng Zarobell. Zheng is the Department Chair of International Studies at the University of San Francisco. Formerly, he holds the positions of Assistant Curator at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art and Associate Curator at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. He is a contributor to Artsy, Art Practical, and the San Francisco Art Quarterly, and has written for numerous exhibition catalogs and curated exhibitions of modern and contemporary art, including Manet and the Sea in 2003, and Frida Kahlo in 2008, New York, Rajani Shettar in 2009, Art Interaction, Kerry James Marshall in 2009, and Indigenous Contemporary in 2015. His first book, Empire of Landscape, was published in 2010, and his next, Art and Global Economy, was published with University of California Press in 2017. So with that, please join me in welcoming Professor Zheng Zarobell.
Thank you, Edward. I'm going to turn this away because we've got another mic here. So I'm delighted to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very excited to be involved in Asia Week presentations. I've seen these over a number of years, various times over the last 10 years or so, and it's been really fantastic. I feel like I'm on a star-studded panel. So I'm going to do what I can to move forward and leave plenty of room for all the other speakers. I'm working on, here we are, my piece is called Displacement as Method, Research and Writing on Global Art. And that's me 10 years ago. It's actually 2009, and that's behind me is Ranjani Shettar's piece, Sing Along, which as you can see is a gallery installation, and that's when I was at SF MoMA. And so I just wanted to begin by saying, at this point, I was bringing art and artists into the museum, and that's, I know, what we heard about in the last panel. But that sort of started a different kind of trajectory for me, because this is about the time, well, first of all, Ranjani Shettar, who made this piece, was coming from Bangalore, and this show at SF MoMA was, in fact, the first presentation of an Indian artist, Indian contemporary artist, in SF MoMA's history. I wanted to put that on the label, but they wouldn't let me. But the long story short, I became very interested in, when I was at SF MoMA, trying to focus on these broader trends that were happening in the art world. I felt as if we had focused for a very long time on artists in San Francisco, LA, New York, maybe London or Berlin, but I wanted to go further. And I felt like there was enough art that was being produced around the world that I really needed to be thinking about that, and that I wanted to bring that into the public realm, right? So being able to host that at the museum was perhaps the beginning. But then I began to work on writing criticism, and indeed a book on art in the global economy. And in some sense, this was a displacement out of the institution and into the world. So that's the first displacement I wanted to address. So yes, here's the book. And I show you one of the graphics that I developed for the book. I was starting to write on art and globalization. I began teaching, after leaving SF MoMA in 2011, I began teaching international studies, and I was interested in applying some of the ideas that I got from international studies to the art world that I'd been experiencing, to my own, in a sense, interest in trying to find out more about what was happening globally, but also thinking about how that was shifting the world that we were living in, and in some sense, how the art world had already shifted, and that the ground under our feet had moved, and many in the art world that I knew didn't even know that that had happened, or certainly weren't acknowledging it. So I wanted to work on that. It caused me to do a lot more traveling, but lots of research on the internet. right? Because indeed, when you're taking on globalization, it's an overall phenomenon. I went to many different countries in my research, but certainly not anywhere near all of them, and indeed not even all regions of the world. So the question, of course, becomes how do you think about research when you're not standing in front of art objects, right? And that, when you're a curator, this is the fundamental conception. And in some sense, I had to get myself away from that in order to try to understand these big questions, right? And my fundamental question was, how do we determine how the art world has become globalized, right? Arts and artworks are on the move, of course, and I was looking at institutions, at exhibition structures, and at the market itself. And as you can see, I did some analysis of art fairs. There's 10 art fairs that I broke down here. And what you're looking at in terms of the colors represents regional representation at the different art fairs. Unfortunately, the slide is not so clear that you can see which all of the art fairs are, so you can't maybe make out what all of the different ones are, and I'm not going to spend the time to sort of name them individually, but I think what you can see, broadly speaking, is that the art fairs either represent one region of the world very effectively, such as here, or they represent a couple of regions of the world. And generally, most of the regions of the world are compacted into a very small area, right? Zonamaco, this is in Mexico City, is, in some sense, based on a graphic like this, you can see how it represents a broader cross-section of global art, perhaps, than other art fairs that I was looking at, like Art Basel Hong Kong, and down the line, right? Art Basel Miami Beach is there as well, Art Istanbul, etc., right? So I was looking at art from 10 art fairs and determining where the dealers had come from. What art fair really is the most global, right? In other words, which has the most pieces, as opposed to the most regional, right? The very specific art fairs, like Manifesta, for example, which is a European art fair, and you see that up here as well. This is where I came to with this, right? I sort of looked at data, information, right? And then tried to visualize that and give a sense of how we might be able to begin to measure what globalization looked like, right? And Zonamaco, as I said, is the most global of the art fairs, and indeed, that's the one that's on the front of the book, on the top there. The bottom is from Moscow, right? It's a museum. I did travel and write on my travels as I got into the research for this book, and I wanted to simply show some of the things that I've written. I started writing art criticism, mostly after leaving the museum, because it seemed like there were tons of conflicts, potential conflicts of interest while I was a curator. But once leaving, I was able to really voice my understanding of the work that I was seeing in a public way, in a way that was impossible at the museum, right? And so this was from a review I published in the India Art Fair, one of the first art fairs I visited. I did a trip to Shanghai and Delhi, and it was a completely eye-opening experience for me. I got to see the Shanghai Biennial from 2012 and the India Art Fair of 2013. So this brings back one back to the question of what differentiates an Indian art fair from others, right? And the answer partly hinges upon historical contingency. What is India's particular history of modernism? And does this offer a new perspective on the art fair? As I left the fairgrounds at the end of the day, the air was thick with smoke from the fires that people use for cooking and heating throughout Delhi, right? Seen through the smoke, the fair invited reflection on the divergent and multiple paths to modernity, right? So we can see art fairs are happening in Istanbul, in Mexico City, in Delhi, indeed around the world, right? There are more than 250 art fairs at this point, which comes out to about little more than 5 a week, right? And so therefore the question is, how do we see these as one phenomenon, right? Or do we start to understand these art fairs as distinct, right? And in some ways contributing to a particular history of a particular place. It seems as if, in some ways, the market erases those distinctions, but actually, just the fact that I was reviewing an art fair sort of demonstrates that no, this one was actually quite particular, and those particulars were very interesting to me, right? On one hand, we have this similarity, this globalization, the market converging. On the other hand, we have these distinct paths to modernity, which were so evident, and particularly in this India Art Fair, there was incredible presentations of modern Indian art, the kind of which one doesn't get a chance to see a lot of in museums in the United States. And so it gave me a new way of reflecting on the contemporary Indian art, and the contemporary South Asian art, and indeed all of the contemporary art that I was looking at there with a different lens. Here's another graphic that I used for the book. Of course, the market is key. We're talking about economic globalization, of course, and this is often expressed in market terms, right? And how do we evaluate the market? Most economists who take a look at this use auctions because these numbers are available. They're available in the public. And this particular graphic is taken from data provided by Claire McAndrew, whose work has really pioneered all new forms of understanding the economics of the art market and indeed even the art industry. This is when she was still working for TFAF, now she works for Art Basel. And so there's actually two different estimates, major fairs producing estimates about what the market is, right? But how do we evaluate it? In this graphic, I'm looking at the different kind of evaluations you get if you look at the value of the art market versus the volume of the art market. And it's quite clear who the industry leaders are. The United States is number one. At this point in 2014, China was number two, and the UK had now been bumped down to third place, with France following at fourth, right? Germany makes a stand, Italy, Switzerland sort of at the bottom there. But the rest of the world, if you'll notice, represents actually 20% of the volume of the art market, right? It's not very big in terms of value, right? Nothing compared to the United States and China, but by the same token, it also indicates to us that there's something shifting, right? In other words, this may only be a snapshot. This is only a moment in time, but we can also see that, if you look at the trends, China would never have been anywhere near those numbers if you look back 10 years, right? The auction houses Polly and Guardian were growing considerably at this time. They are now number 3 and 4 in the world behind Christie's and Sotheby's. And so this is reflected in these numbers, right? But also the difference between looking in how much art is being transacted versus where the value in the market actually is turns out to be another interesting way of thinking about this. I also endeavored to write criticism around this issue, right? And so here's an essay that I wrote called Misreading the Art Market in San Francisco Art Quarterly. In the simplest terms, the auction houses, Christie's and Sotheby's, undisputed industry leaders with 38% of the global art auction share combined, and this thanks to Claire McAndrew, play an essential role for any market. They provide liquidity. If you own a work of art that you no longer want and you need money that would come from selling the work, the auction house provides a place for you to convert your asset to cash. The fact that art auctions exist is proof that there is such a thing as an art market, right? Not an abstract economic context, right? The way economists would conceive of a market, but a real location where goods are exchanged and money tendered, even if, that happens through wire transfer. In other words, there's still a kind of, there's an invisible aspect to it, of course, but the auction houses show us that this is a place where the art market comes to exist. And once again, you can find globalization in either looking at multiple markets, right, thinking about how each of these countries has a distinct art market which is particular to its own history, or you can look at globalization as the convergence of these forces of the market. And then the spread of those forces, because of course those forces first converged in the United Kingdom, spread to the United States, right? But now China, as we see, is a huge player in the global art auction market. Of course, the art market in general is driven by the rich, right? And one of the things I was interested in is the transfer of wealth. And I don't mean, actually that's probably a bad term to use. Transfer of wealth doesn't quite catch it. The idea, and this is displayed here, is that the number of wealthy individuals is growing. So high net worth individuals is what's being evaluated here. And we're looking at the difference between 2000, 2001 and 2013, 2014. Once again, thanks Claire McAndrew. But what we're seeing here are interesting trends, right? We see that in North America, the number of high net worth individuals, these are people who have assets of more than $1 million, not counting their home, right? Has increased by about 100%, right? And it's gone from 7.5 million to 14.9 million. In Europe, the growth is only 48%, right? So it's pretty anemic by comparison, about half of what happened in North America. But look at China, look at Asia, right? Asia Pacific region, 215% growth. More than doubling, you know, the pace of growth more than doubles what's going on in North America, right? So yes, we've heard about the sort of the concentration of wealth from a variety of sources, you know, Thomas Piketty and others, right? But what we're also witnessing is a distribution of wealth in different geographical locations, and you can see that the numbers, the sheer numbers, right, of the Asia Pacific region is coming, not only eclipsing Europe, but coming actually pretty close to North America. So what we're seeing is tremendous growth in these emerging markets. Latin America, 241% growth, that's actually the highest. But even in Africa and the Middle East, they are outpacing growth in North America, right? And so, of course, this is going to affect how the art market works. This represents yet another form of displacement, if you will, the displacement of wealth, right? So that wealth is growing faster in these other regions than it is in the traditional art centers. And this is a piece of writing from the book where I take this on. Claire McAndrew analyzes these figures in her most recent art market report. That's a typo. Among those 12 million, it is estimated that roughly 600,000 are involved in the art market, right? So this is, we're talking about high net worth individuals here, and wealth overall. Further, the wealth portfolios of the high net worth individuals include 10% investments for passion and art. As a percentage of that category, 17% globally, right? Since the total wealth of high net worth individuals is currently estimated at 4.62 trillion, approximately 4.62 trillion, 46.2 versus 4.62 trillion is invested in passion investments, yachts, wine, etc., jewelry, of which 17% is art. Therefore, back of the envelope calculation tells us that there's about $785 billion invested in art globally, right? Once again, these are meta estimates. This is not a on-the-ground study where somebody's actually telling up values, right? But the value that this brings to our analysis of the art market is that it gives us a much bigger picture. If we look at transactions on a year-on-year, you know, the number's around 60 billion. Different estimates have emerged. The new TFAP estimate is closer to 40, but the bottom line is the number seems relatively small as an industry in the globe, you know, global industry, right? But if we think about it differently, as in terms of how much value has been amassed in art, and this is needless to say some years ago, we can see that the size and scale of the art market is actually quite a lot bigger. This gives us a big picture, right, from which we can then extrapolate and develop a different kind of analysis about how the art market works, who's involved with it, and how that money is being spread around. So I was writing on the totality of the art market. I was thinking about globalization. I was looking at everything everywhere and trying to capture a moment of the present. This is a very taxing kind of research because every time you read a new article, and I do read a lot of articles, you've got something else you need to put in that book, right? And with our age of information, there's so much information, and there's no way that you're going to get it all in one book, right? So needless to say, that would set me up for a lot of criticism from a variety of quarters, and I'm sure I'll be hearing that. But the value of this is to create an understanding more broadly of the structures, right? And the way in which those structures operate, the way in which the value is held in the art market. But it's not where this is not the direction that I want to continue necessarily with my own research and writing. It's now that I'm an academic, I can switch projects and move on to something else. And so my next project is actually much more situated, you might say. I'm working on a project on emerging Asian megacities. And I'm specifically interested in the development of how does art affect, and how is it affected by rapid urban development in Asia, right? And what you're seeing here is a photograph I took of Karachi when I was visiting there. and a work by a Karachi artist, Rui Ahmed, called Tread Carefully, right, which is actually one of a series of works that she did around the geography of Karachi and how one navigates that as a citizen, right? The city of Karachi was about 400,000 in 1947 when partition happened. Today, the estimates range from between 15 million and 25 million, depending on whether you're counting the city proper, the suburbs, the entire metropolitan area, and also, you know, as I learned from an urbanist while I was there in Karachi, the national government has a reason to underestimate the population of Karachi because, of course, it's about resource distribution. Karachi is by far the biggest city in Pakistan, and nevertheless, it is not where the rulers of Pakistan live. It's not Islamabad, but it's also not Lahore, where a lot of the wealth and power has been concentrated for centuries, right? Karachi is a new city. It's an instant city, as Steve Inskeep would say, because it's grown from 400,000 to 25 million in a space of less than 7 years, right? So that means, just to do a reality check, the population of Karachi is doubling every 10 to 15 years. So what is it like to live in a place like that? Now, if you look at the UN estimates, once again, the big picture, they're looking at population growth, and they say that by 2050, there'll be 2.35 billion more people living in cities than live in them currently. Right? The United States and Europe are already highly urbanized, even Latin America, and so a lot of that growth is going to occur in Asia and in Africa. And so I'm interested in doing a project that brings together a variety of cities in different regions, different nations, but also different regions. So I'm looking at Karachi, Delhi, Jakarta, and Shanghai, right? Not the traditional Asian megacities you might think of, Tokyo, Seoul, Beijing, but Hong Kong, but these new emerging cities that are growing so fast. And the question, of course, is how do we grasp that? And I think this is something that art can do for us, right? This art gives us an angle. So I'm just going to finish with this piece that I wrote for a publication that was published in the Society for Asian Arts journal Lotus Leaves in May. Rather than examine the structural developments of Karachi, this analysis will trace the intersection between the structural and personal dimension of urban experience. For the inhabitants of the city, its social stratification, violence, and informality are expressed on a day-to-day basis, and artists working in the city now have captured this dynamic in their works. This study endeavors to explore the subjective aspects of urban transformation as captured through artistic activities, some of which were developed in private, like the artwork by Rui Ahmed, but all have been realized publicly, right? And so in this sense, art gives us a very different kind of perspective on social processes. So rather than trying to apply the social processes to the arts, I've now switched it around so that I'm applying the arts to the social processes. And with that, I think I will stop. But now I switch over to my job as moderator. It's my job to introduce now Lilly Wei. Lilly Wei is a New York-based independent curator, writer, and journalist and critic, whose area of interest is global contemporary art, and in particular, emerging art and artists, while writing frequently on international exhibitions and biennials. Her work has appeared in dozens of publications worldwide, and she's a long-time contributor to Art in America and a contributing editor to Art News in the United States. The author of numerous catalogs and monographs, she has curated exhibitions in the US, Europe, and Asia. Wei lectures frequently on critical and curatorial practices and sits on the board of several not-for-profit art institutions and organizations. She was born in Chengdu, China, and has an MA in art history from Columbia University, New York. Please join me in welcoming Lilly Wei.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you all for being here. I would say, despite all of that, I feel like I'm a generalist, while everyone else here seems like a specialist. And all I can say is, crazy rich what? Asians and everyone else? After all of that. When I was asked to do this talk, I was looking at the brief, which is something about cultural shifts, and so I began to think about cultural shifts, and I was just thinking that, as I said, I'm kind of maybe a self-described amateur, but I was just thinking of the way that Asian art has shifted, or global art has shifted in even the past 30 years. I mean, I thought of like 1989 as a kind of landmark date. I mean, for so many reasons. I mean, it was, of course, in China, the Tiananmen Square, and it was also the fall of the Berlin Wall. But but there was also something else. It was this exhibition that, for me, was always a huge landmark and inspiration, which was Magicien de la Terre. I mean, just even the name I found to be totally wonderful. And it was a problematical exhibition, I suppose, but it was the first truly global exhibition. Before that, let's go back to Documenta. It was called an international exhibition, but I think they meant international in those days to mean a couple of Americans, maybe some Canadians, and one or two Japanese artists. And that was international. And this, happened it kept going for a while like that. And then when we got to Magicien de la Terre, Jean, why do I get his name wrong? Jean Hubert Martin, I always want to say it the other way, but Jean Hubert Martin said, let's say 100% of exhibitions ignore 80% of the world. And he wanted to do something about that. So this exhibition was maybe run a little bit like what? Open admissions? I mean, no, what's the word I want? When you have,
Open call?
oh, no, well, no, like slated, when you have, you all know what I mean. I'm just playing. But anyway, this was going to be 50% Western, 50% Western European, and the rest of it will be from the rest of the world, elsewhere. And this truly was maybe the first time that this work had been shown in a context where it was looked at as art, not as ethnography or sociology or anthropology. And that was also, something that was very new. So some people credit that exhibition and that curator with being a direct link to a kind of global view of art, not necessarily in any economic sense at that point, because I don't think so. And I think that one of the things that came up in this discussion, if you look at the graphs, which I wasn't, following that closely because I couldn't see them, but in your explanation that if you look at China and you look at the United States, I mean, the one thing that's really evident is the art is where the money is. And Chinese art is now commanding what it does because of the second largest economy, and some people say it will very soon, like within 5 minutes, be the first, largest economy. So anyway, so 1989, and then at this show in 1989, there were 3 Chinese artists, and that 3 contemporary Chinese artists, and that was the beginning. And then in the 90s, Chinese contemporary artists began to show up in Venice, in Sao Paulo, around the world. And then in 1998, we had in New York, Inside Out, which was actually, I thought, revelatory. I mean, it was so exciting. There were so many artists. It represented, I'm sure a lot of you know this, but so bear with me. I'm just giving you a sort of confession, memoir, or something of my experiences my total experiences maybe in the art world. So, so they were for Hong Kong, Taiwan, mainland, and the Chinese who had moved abroad. And that really, I think, was probably, again, the beginning of this kind of yellow fever, or this, craze for Asian, which has its own problems, but nonetheless, it was, again, the start of paying real attention to Asian artists, but the Chinese artists. But I think that kind of sets the template. Once you start to realize there are other artists in the world, and you can, you know, show them, you can talk about them. They're important, but they also sell. This becomes like, you know, gravy for everyone. I mean, they get really, really excited, and you can see all the other countries that have sort of lined up, you know, in that kind of stream. So in 1998, which is 10 years later, do you see how slow things are really sort of moving? And now it doesn't happen at all because, you know, it'd be instant practically. We've moved so much faster in the way we approach everything. But so this wonderful show, which by the way, it was criticized, and you know, I think it was very, very telling criticism then that for some people this work didn't look Chinese. They were kind of disappointed. They thought it looked, well, you know, like too much like European or Western art. That it was derivative and like that. But for most people, they thought it was really a fresh new take, and the way they kind of blended that lexicon of East and West, and it was amusing, it was witty, it was satirical, it was also pushing a lot of buttons. I mean, it was extreme in some instances. I mean, we can think of someone like Zheng Wang, you know, in the latrine. There's a lot of body art, things that weren't really seen. So I think, you know, that was another kind of moving of the gauge. Now, I was supposed to show some slides, some images, because I was asked, and so let me just maybe get to them. And so in this discussion or thinking about this, you know, there's this phrase, "What you see is what you see," which is a classic phrase for for minimalism, as coined by Frank Stella in, I guess it was 1963, pretty early on. And it seemed pretty, you know, it's kind of summed up that rather swaggering male minimalist attitude. As we talk, people move on. He's not doing that anymore, but still. So what you see is what you see. But, you know, I thought of it as something else, as maybe what you see is what you're given to see. What you see is what you're capable of seeing at any given time. So let's say we weren't able to really look at Chinese contemporary art. I mean, we didn't know how to contextualize it, and maybe we didn't know how to look at a lot of art elsewhere because we didn't know how to contextualize it. And because our point of view from here, I mean, and we all have a point of view, we all have a location, makes us very provincial, each in our own way. So we have that. Anyway, so this show is, as you can recognize, is it's the theater of the world, China and art since 1989, which was just at the Guggenheim a year ago, I think, and is coming to SF MoMA, and I guess the comment there would be, so you get to see this, right? So then you see what you see. Let me just show you some images just because of, why not? Then it'll kind of refresh your memory. The artists in this show, a lot of them completely reprised the work that was in the Inside Out show. We can talk about this a little bit later. So I think that in some ways it was one of the things that was a little disappointing about this show because it really didn't, it stopped at 2008, but that wasn't the point. They should have had, I mean, it would have been nicer to have maybe some newer work and maybe some different artists that didn't make it the first time around. And then they also did a show at the Guggenheim right after called One Hand Clapping, which focused on 5 younger artists, and Cao Fei was one of them, and who is, I'm sure all of you, many of you, all of you know, who is a wonderful artist, and then also this young artist Wang Ping, who is from Hong Kong, and he's been at least in New York and I guess elsewhere. I mean, he's everybody, every curator's pick, every critic's pick. He was astounding in the show at the New Museum, in the Triennial, and I think if you like the term, the voice of a generation, he certainly does represent, at least for right now, the voice of the generation. He's scatological, he's perverse, he's crude, but he does, and the animations are sort of, I think, what anyone thinks they could find on the internet. But then it turns it around, and he turns out to have, at least I think so, and I think you might agree, he turns out to have a really kind of almost tender moral vision that is surprising in all that perversity. And it's that balance that I think, that vulnerability, that makes him such an amazing artist. And then just because also the show that's here of abstract artists, Chinese artists, which is at Nanhai, second floor, first floor? First floor, okay. So hopefully when this is over, you will take a look. These are 6 artists of Chinese, 6 artists who were born in China, but they now work, 3 still in China and 3 abroad. And just to give you an idea, that these 2 do not necessarily look Chinese. And Shengtian, one of the artists in the show, said that he found that China did not really respond to abstract art, and that his art had been mistaken for a Western person. And it's interesting, I think, because he is so imbued in the tradition of, but I'll get to his, what Zheng has it yet. So he's so much infused with a tradition of literati painting and all of that, but it comes out in this minimalist way. And then I also thought it was interesting because a lot of Western artists had always thought this kind of mystical, this kind of minimal, spiritual work was Chinese. so they tend, it just tends to show how you read this, how you parse these works, what the context is. And I think to translate this across cultures can be amazing. It can be very, it can create misunderstandings, but it can also, I think, create a great deal of connection. It's a complex task, and I don't think anyone can do it perfectly. So that said, we were talking about cultural shifts, and I don't know that critics can affect cultural shifts. I would bow to the market a little more to be realistic. But on the other hand, critics can do something, and they certainly do. They write, but it's part of an aggregate of impact, I think. There are, of course, museums. There are all kinds of institutions and organizations that manage to take work from other parts of the world and move it around and bring it. If we talk specifically about the United States, there are lots of residencies, there are nonprofits. I would stress that in a way because I'm very enamored I'm on actually a number of boards of small nonprofits, and I really find that they do wonderful work. And I think the only emphasis on money there is money to keep the organization operative, which isn't always easy, but they serve another population than Karen said something about work going into a museum as if it were entombed, and it's not, I know she doesn't mean that, but certainly a lot of these museums have now been very active in having a contemporary program, a component that is completely belies that statement. But on the other hand, you have to, I think, reach a certain ranking or a certain kind of recognition before you get your museum show. So what do you do before that? So these other things, these smaller organizations that actually pinpoint, certain parts, certain countries, certain areas of the world, I think they're very important. And I also think it's like the grassroots. This is bothering everyone. This is where the first talent comes up. This is where you maybe first meet certain artists as they are expanding. But what if they never do? It's fine too. I think that they should have their ability to show. They should have a place to show. And I think a lot of these kinds of organizations they're not looking for the investment, not even the cachet. They're just trying to help artists have a place to show, a place to express themselves, and this is all part, I think, of a greater dialogue. So I also do a lot of studio visits, and I think that is also another, incredibly important place in which to see art and to bring it out. I mean, this is what curators do. I mean, you are professional curators. I say that I'm an independent curator, which may mean that more of an amateur in a way, or when someone asks me to do exhibitions. But I find that just the studio visit in terms of writing about artists, I find really, really important. So we've covered a lot of these points. I guess I really, I do want to say that this kind of cultural shift has happened. I think we're in the middle of it right now in many ways. Just even by technology, by the fact that we can all get on a plane, and many of us do, most of us do, and we can be anywhere in the world in 24 hours. Okay, you can't go into the Himalayas, but you can, and then you really work. But it is quick, that we didn't have that kind of proximity. When I came to this country, my parents never expected to ever see their parents again, because, and then of course that didn't happen, but they did. But the fact is, this kind of proximity that some of us in this audience take for absolute granted, is just sort of a fact of life, and also that you can see anything on your computer screen in a second. So all of that too makes for a different kind of world, and I think we all probably know that, but that it has completely, I think, affected the way the structure of the art world has been shaping up, including all the art fairs, the biennials. I mean, the biennials have sort of given way to the art fairs, and who knows where we talked a little bit about this yesterday or today, about where galleries are today. But again, I think in a way maybe all of this will kind of settle down and become interconnected. I mean, there'll be forces within the newer art world. There'll be different ways to look at art, to access art, to buy art, to see art. And as we know, many museums have put their entire collection online now, which is enormously useful. And then if we talk about Asian resources, I mean, there are so many places like, Asian Art Archives, which now have made it possible to access information about artists that we weren't able to, and also this language thing, because language is difficult. I think a lot of, I'm just being specifically referring to Chinese artists, but contemporary Chinese, but it could be anybody. The exchange of students in art schools, I mean, that's a new thing, and also because of that, a lot of people are using English as a default, which helps for communication. Translations, as I've said, has often been a problem. What you read about an artist is almost illegible. I mean, in terms of English, I mean, some of it's charming, but it's just, you know, it's just not, it's not geared to what we think of as some, you know, it's just odd, and some of the translations are very bad, and so that doesn't help the conveyance. But I think a lot of that too is shifting, and there are all these programs. I mean, I may say that, well, when I started out, you didn't have to have a degree to be a curator, you know. But of course, I think everyone's learned something from it, and I think a lot of that has been of great use and effect. But I also think that, you know, there was a day where you could just go out there and, you know, you could find some artists and you could just make a show, and that was all right too. So now, I did have notes, but I forgot to look at them. Oh, so how much time do I have? I didn't actually look. What do you think? I have 1 minute? Well, okay. I was just, maybe just to go back to one thing about how we get to look at things, how these things are constructed, how we construct Asian identity, how we look, what kind of art we actually see and how we see it. I think that's what really interests me the most, and as someone used the word net neutral, I mean, what we see, is it net neutral? Because someone else asked earlier if there were such a thing as, I mean, how do you pick the work that goes into the institutions, even the nonprofit institutions, and you know, that also is something that is a filter of sorts. So this is a construct, and hopefully if we can make it as widely based as possible, then that would be, you know, I think a good thing for everyone. And I think about a normalization, where, you know, that maybe we don't necessarily have to stress identity so much, because it becomes just part of the whole conversation of what art is in this world. Maybe that won't happen, or not soon, but, you know, I was so hopeful at one point before all of this happened that we were sort of moving toward a global world, a global everything, and it hasn't happened, and in fact, of course, it looks like we're all kind of going backwards. But maybe it's just, hopefully, and I want to believe it, that it's just a momentary pause, and so then it will be, you know, to the greater world, to the greater planet Earth. Does that sound really hippie-ish? On that.
All right. So now I'm going to introduce Keith Wallace. Keith Wallace has been a curator of contemporary art since 1979. From 1991 to 2001, he was the director-curator of the Contemporary Art Gallery in Vancouver, where he developed a program of regional, national, and international exhibitions. He's been a supporter of artist-run centers and wrote a history of Vancouver ARCs for Vancouver Anthology in 1991, edited by Stan Douglas, and edited Whispered Art History in 1993, celebrating 20 years of the Western Front, one of Canada's longest-running ARCs. In 2004, he organized InFest, International Artist-Run Culture, that brought together 250 artists and administrators from 25 countries. He was Associate Director and Curator of the Morris and Helen Belkin Art Gallery at the University of British Columbia from 2005 to 2008, and 2012 to 2015. Since 2004, Wallace has been Editor-in-Chief of Yishu, Journal of Contemporary Chinese Art. Please join me in welcoming Keith Wallace.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? I just would like to thank the Nanhai Art for the invitation to come here today. And I would also like to qualify that I'm a stand-in for my colleague, managing editor of Yishu, Shengtian, who unfortunately couldn't be here. So I hope that I can fill his shoes in some way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to very briefly show some images of what Yishu Journal of Contemporary Chinese Art does, for those who may not know. It's going to be very quick. And then I'm going to discuss some of our approaches towards the magazine or the journal, and some of the issues that we're interested in. So, Yishu Journal of Contemporary Chinese Art was inaugurated in 2002. The question is why. Artist Ken Lum and Shengtian felt that there was no English language publication on contemporary Chinese art, and felt that it was important to distribute a discourse internationally about Chinese art. How are we funded? We're funded really primarily by patrons. We had one patron for a number of years, and I have to thank Katie Sheen of Art Co in Taipei, who has supported us all these years, 16 years now, and has never interfered in any way in terms of our editorial content. And we don't have a board of directors. We do have a nonprofit society, the Yishu Initiative for Contemporary Chinese Art, that does have a board of directors, but in terms of the publication itself, there isn't. So I feel very honored and blessed to be able to have really complete freedom in terms of the content of our publication. We do have other patrons now that support the publishing of the magazine, but also some of the other initiatives that we have taken, and I'll get to those in a minute. I just wanted to give a summary of our subscribers, and they are primarily, we don't have a large distribution. We print about 3,500 copies on each issue. We started out doing 4 issues a year. We now do 6 issues a year. Most of our subscribers are university libraries, galleries, museums, and then we have art professionals as well. We don't have a large a bookstore presence, and as I say, like some of you may not even know about us, that we actually exist. Our regions of distribution, it is quite international, although we don't have a lot of distribution in South America or Africa. And a lot of our readers, English is not their first language. So in terms of our editorial approach, we feel it's very important that clarity is central to the texts and how the writers write. So we work very closely with them. Things that may be common knowledge to somebody in one region in New York may not be common knowledge to somebody in Australia. So qualifying ideas is very important for us. We were invited to participate in the magazine section at the 12th Documenta in Kassel, Germany, which has sort of made us feel quite good. From 2005, we've exhibited with booths at Art Basel in Switzerland, and Art Basel Miami Beach, and Art Basel Hong Kong. And for each of those art fairs, we also organize a panel discussion. In 2008, we had the Yishu Day launch with in Shanghai at the Zendai Museum of Modern Art. So we collaborate with a lot of organizations for events, which we've done with the Asia Art Archive at Art Basel. We've organized panel discussions with their programs. We also have an online presence in which one can subscribe to a PDF version of the publication, which is much less expensive, because postage these days creates a real problem in terms of the costs. And people can also buy individual articles, which are very inexpensive. They're about $2 each. So, and we have a search engine as well, so you can put in keywords if there's artists that you're looking for, or exhibitions or whatever, you can find articles on them. In 2010, we inaugurated the Yishu Award for Critical Writing on Contemporary Chinese Art. This is another situation where we rely on patrons, and so we have particular patrons who will support this particular project. We haven't been able to do it every year. I think there's 2 years since 2010 that we haven't been able to do it because we didn't have the money. The first one took place at the Xi'an Art Museum in 2010. In 2016, we gave out the award at the Art 21 Art Fair in Shanghai. And the award's very important for us. Our process is very simple. We're a staff of 6 people who put this publication out. So we don't want to get into some big bureaucratic jury system or whatever. So we just invite 2 scholars or historians who are well-versed in contemporary Chinese art to simply select a writer who they think would be deserving of the award, which is $5,000 Canadian. And we don't interfere with their selection process in any way. And the writer just gets an email from me saying, you've been awarded this award. So there's no submission process. And they get to go to Shanghai or Hong Kong to receive their award. And so we feel that this is very important in encouraging writing on contemporary Chinese art. Another one of our projects is we produce 50 artist videos, interviews with them. This is mostly a project of Shengtian. And for the first 50 issues of Yishu, it was like each artist that had been on the cover, we did an interview with that particular artist. So we have these kind of quirky little projects. And finally, we have Yishu for students. So since 2011, we have been sending full sets of the publication to different universities, and we've done 40 sets of these now. And I do have to acknowledge the San Francisco collector who was the first patron of this particular project, Zheng, and really got this project going. So it's very important to us that our publication does get distributed in different ways to universities because it can be used for research purposes, and that's really a part of our purpose in that while we're talking about contemporary Chinese art and mostly contemporary issues, we do see it as being about history and about being about future research. So that's going to be the end of the images. And so I'm going to speak now about our approach to the publication and the kinds of issues that we are interested in. I've been working with Yishu for 14 years now. Didn't really come into it with any agenda, and it's really evolved over time according to the kinds of interests that writers have. And I kind of echo Karen's comments about reforming and subjectivity being a part of the process of creativity. And I come out of a curatorial background, so I sort of see this as curating, and I also see it as being quite intuitive, and that I'm not like plotting out what I think the history is necessarily, but I get information from people, and I sort of try and figure out what is appropriate. So we do articles, we do interviews, we do panel discussions, we do reviews of exhibitions, we do special thematic issues. We've done ones on cities, we've done a special issue on public art in Taiwan, curatorial practices. We did a special issue on artists working with archives, Long March project out of Beijing. We did a special issue on their education project. And where does our material come from? We do commission writers at times for specific things that we feel are important that should be written about, but we also really rely on a submission process of writers coming to us. And the reason we do that is I'm very interested in writers who want to have something to talk about. So if we say, oh, we want you to go and review an exhibition, sure, they might go and review the exhibition, but they might be doing that as a kind of job, in a sense. But we're really interested in writers who I have something that I want to talk about. And I'm just in discussion with a writer right now who's, I'm not going to name her name, but she's just publishing a book on the museum boom in mainland China. And she said to me, well, there's things I couldn't put in the book because people would be offended. And would you be interested in me kind of expanding upon issues in the book? Yes. So we're interested in that kind of commitment. Is the microphone still on?
Nope.
Right. What went wired up? Can we can keep. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. So where was I? Oh yes. So we're interested in writers who really have something that they want to talk about, that they want to express. And our texts, originally we were kind of this academic journal, but we were not peer-reviewed. And when I came on board as the editor-in-chief, I really decided I want a diversity of voices. So we have, important scholars who provide articles for us, but we're also very interested in younger writers, and we have a lot of younger writers. Hello? Okay, I won't talk so loud. We have a lot of younger writers who come to us, and we do mentor them. And we think that it's extremely important to work with these writers because they are the future historians of contemporary Chinese art, and they need support, and it's often very hard for them to find a platform in which to express themselves. So over the years, we also feel it's important to follow through over time with a number of issues that go beyond an article on an artist or a review of an exhibition. And so we have covered issues such as curatorial strategies, artist-run culture. I come out of the artist-run scene, and so it's something that's dear to my heart. It's important for me to support artists who are not in the mainstream, are not a part of the what is now an art industry. It used to be an art scene, then it was an art world, and then it was an art system, and now it's a big industry. And for those artists to not have to fall into the protocols that industries require in order to become successful. So we feel it's very important to provide a platform for those artists who are attempting to function outside of the mainstream world. We have done many articles on women artists, and actually most of the writers for our publication are women. I don't know why that is, but so be it, and I'm happy. We have followed through with articles on the museum boom and the museum culture in different cities at different times over the years. We have followed artist projects and initiatives that exist outside of major urban centers. And Betty Sue, I kind of understand what you're talking about. It's not so much the Anthropocene that we're dealing with, but in many cases our current issue has an article by Lu Mingjun, which is on what he calls frontier art. Artists that have gone out into the desert, northwest China, southwest China, and are working with small communities and doing projects in the middle of nowhere in some cases. Also artists who have gone back to their towns and villages because they can't exist in the main centers, and they are doing projects with their own communities and returning to their communities. So this is something that's very important for us. We also have been dealing with issues of censorship and state pressures, and again in our current issue, which was on the table but it seems to be gone, Pak Shengtian, who has we have an article on his work. He's a Hong Kong artist who's very interested in the possibilities of protest in public spaces, especially within the context of Hong Kong relative to mainland China. Okay. We also do texts that are deal with historical issues, and that is in relationship to whether those historical artists have an impact upon what's happening, 5 minutes, okay, in contemporary Chinese art now. And my belief is that art does not stay in its period of time. We look at that art from a contemporary perspective. So historical art can be looked at within a contemporary perspective. And we can't actually look at it the way that it was originally made because we don't live at that time. Okay. Oh, and then we, oh dear. Then we try and look at the relationship of Greater China outside of the binary of the East and the West. So we have done a number of issues. We've collaborated with Asia Art Archive, the Guggenheim New York, the World Biennial Foundation on conferences that they have done about particular issues that go way beyond China, but that deal with Southeast Asia, South Asia, East Asia, and so China is but one component within a larger context. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to put mainland China or Hong Kong within a larger context of the rest of Asia. And also we have articles on artists who are not Chinese. Slavs and Tatars, for example, did a project at the Xi'an OCAP in which they were talking about the Silk Route and how the Turkish language made its way from Turkey up into northwest China, Urumqi, and how language crosses barriers and how globalization was actually happening centuries ago. And then, how much time have we got left? Oh, 3 minutes, okay. So the final thing that I want to talk about, and one of the main things that actually affects my editorial approach is what China are we talking about? And people are so often talking about China, and without kind of qualifying what China they're talking about. Are they talking about mainland China? Are they talking about Hong Kong? Are they talking about Taiwan? Are they talking about Macau? Are they talking about the vast Chinese diaspora, which extends all around the world? And I'm sure that San Francisco understands what that is all about, as does Vancouver. So this is an extremely important aspect for us to explore, because there is no monolithic China. There is no singular concept of what China is. China is everywhere. So the question that we have in the back of our mind is, where is China and what is China? Thank you.
All right. I'm going to try to use this microphone this time, although it doesn't sound like it's working so well. Go back. Hello. Okay, there we go. All right, and for our final speaker, last but certainly not least, Richard Vine is the managing editor of Art in America. He holds a PhD in literature from the University of Chicago and previously served as editor-in-chief of the Chicago Review and of Dialogue, an art journal. He has taught at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, the American Conservatory of Music, the University of Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, and the New School for Social Research and New York University. Some 300 of his articles, reviews, and interviews have appeared in the various journals, including Art in America, Salamagundi, the Georgia Review, Tima Celeste, Modern Poetry Studies, and the New Criterion. His critical books include the career survey Ad Nerdrum, Paintings, Sketches, and Drawings in 2001, and New China, New Art from 2008, which traces the emergence of avant-garde art in post-Mao China. In 2016, he published the crime novel Soho Sins, set in New York art world of the 1990s. And in addition, Vine has co-curated, my gosh, he's done so many things, exhibitions at the National Museum of China, Beijing in 2013, the National Academy of Art in New Delhi, India in 2015, and the John Jay College of Criminal Justice, New York in 2016. Please join me in welcoming Richard Vine.
I'm going to try. Is this working at all?
Yep.
It's good? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
How do we advance? So originally I didn't plan to say anything at all about myself, but then I realized everybody else did. Apparently I didn't get the memo. So I'll tell you one relevant story. The first time I set foot in China was in the year 2000 to attend the Shanghai Biennale, which was a kind of landmark event, as you know. It was the first time it went truly international. It was curated by Ho Han Ru, this very cosmopolitan figure. And it was surrounded, well, the story. So I arrived, you know, sort of the ignorant American. My images of China were all from the Cultural Revolution. You know, I find myself suddenly on the ground in Shanghai, which looks like Tomorrowland. So I'm already a little disoriented. And then I went through the biennial, which was very, very interesting. And I was literally standing on the lawn of the museum wondering what to do next. And this very quite attractive woman came up to me and said in perfect English, "Did you enjoy the biennial?" "Yeah." "What was your favorite?" Conversation. And then finally she turned to me and said, "Now would you like to see some really interesting art?" At which point I turned into the boy from Ohio, like this existential moment. And I said, "As a matter of fact, I would." It turned out that she was the wife of one of the most famous artists in China, and they took me around to see all of the satellite shows. There were at least half a dozen, curated by independent curators, groups of artists. More interesting than the biennial itself, in fact. And the one that everyone knows, of course, is the Fuck Off show that Ai Weiwei did with Feng Ruyi. So that was my introduction. And the irony is that I gave a talk at the Shanghai Biennale that was titled "Welcome to the Monoculture." And my thesis was that, you know, the world is now being knit together in so many different ways, economically and politically and culturally, that very soon, you know, we will be in effect one culture with local inflections, sort of local dialects, but essentially we'll be one world. And I look around today and I say, boy, was I wrong. So you might keep that in mind in terms of my critical acumen as I make the rest of my remarks. Because I'm going to be talking about the difficulty of critical apprehension, particularly how it's difficult for Western writers and critics to properly understand Asian aesthetics. And the kinds of problems that leads to. And I feel a little bit like, you know, I'm betraying the theme of the afternoon, because this is all about cultural unification. You know, there's a very nice show downstairs, which is literally called Bridging Asia and the West. And the logo of Asia Art Week is this bridge, which sort of goes off into nowhere, I know. Gives me some pause for concern. When Karen was speaking earlier, she showed the slide of the Stars exhibition in 1979, and I think one of the things we have to remember is how new this phenomenon is. I'm going to be speaking not about Asia, but about Chinese art primarily. That's what I know best. 39 years ago, essentially, when all of this began. And at first, it was kind of a matter of steady integration. Bit by bit, artists in mainland China, left places like the East Village and showed their work abroad and got galleries, and museum trustees and curators began jetting into Shanghai and Beijing, and then the auctions kicked in the year 2006 was the first, I think, in New York auction of contemporary Chinese art. And it all seemed to go along pretty well. And then, in fact, between 2000 and 2004, a kind of market mania took hold, and the prices for contemporary Chinese art went sky high. And then in 2008, the world financial crisis hit. We tend to forget that now. But, in economic terms, the world almost ended in 2008. And for us, one of the implications of that was that there was a kind of mutual retraction. That curators and collectors in the West became much more cautious about trying to acquire work that fundamentally they didn't really understand, and I think that some artists and curators in China grew more skeptical about the West because they found themselves being labeled derivative, burdened with this term of, late, you're late to the party kind of thing. And interestingly, within China itself, the government began to recognize contemporary art, which it had long disdained, as a potential soft power asset. And they began to put money behind it in various ways. And so you had various attempts to sort of broach the Western market and the Western curatorial system, with the caveat that the work should maintain its Chinese characteristics. Now, the great irony is that the Communist Party, which spent 30 years trying to destroy Chinese tradition, now presents itself as the great defender and preserver of that tradition, because they have realized how important cultural identity is to people, including contemporary artists. Even the most cynical or the most cosmopolitan contemporary artist still responds to this idea of basic Chineseness. I never hear an American artist say to me, do you think my work is American enough? But this is a question that plays upon the mind of Chinese artists constantly. Even, of course, people who are doing contemporary ink painting, but also people who are doing computer art and virtual reality. It just is a fundamental concern. So what I want to look at with my slides is the problems that arise when artists begin to insist on that tradition and that cultural identity, and the difficulty that Western critics can have with it. So I'm calling it Asian art in Western eyes. first slide, maybe tradition innovation. I realized sort of on the plane that if I were doing this again, I would have one more slide, which would be harmony versus conflict. Because one of the great essentials of Asian culture is the desire for harmony, which dovetails very nicely, of course, with the government's desire to control. Whereas the Western mentality is predicated in many ways, and to a great degree, on the idea of conflicting interests. If you read Faulkner, I was always wondering why is it that like, no matter what's happening in Faulkner, there's always this tension. Well, I realized if he has two people in a room, they each want something slightly different. And it could be very simple. It could be like, I think we ought to cook the beans with bacon. No, I think we ought to cook the beans with honey. But there's always something. And that's sort of been our way of going about things. But to take the first major category, tradition and innovation. Here's a very early example, and I shudder to be standing up here making comments on traditional Chinese art in the presence of Michael. Forgive me. As I understand it, this is one of the earlier extant examples of classic landscape painting. Extremely refined, beautiful work, which means that there must have been hundreds and hundreds of years of development preceding this already, right? And here we are, roughly 1,000 years later. Now, to a Westerner, this lack of change is astounding, right? Specialists will say, okay, well, there are lots of changes in the brushwork, and the use of materials, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But in the end, right, it's mountains and water and clouds for 10 centuries. And what's interesting is, of course, what's left out, which is all the grit of everyday life, which is wars and revolutions, including the Industrial Revolution. One of our authors was just doing a piece on landscape painting, and he was talking about the artist's brush on the paper or the silk, reproducing the cosmological moment of generation, the void transforming itself into the 10,000 things. And I wanted to ask him, why is it the 10,000 things are always mountains and rivers and birds and flowers? Why don't we ever get a nice air conditioner or a pencil sharpener? Contrast that to our mentality in the West, right? Now here's the show. Now the irony is that this sort of has the same compositional structure. and one person has suggested that it looks a little bit like a seated Buddha. But my point is that Duchamp, of course, is a great example of this break with all things past. Classically in the West, you had noble subjects, noble materials, noble techniques, which were the realm of art. And then Duchamp comes along and says, no, we can make art about anything, out of anything. The great credo of Western modernism was formulated by Ezra Pound in 1934 with this notion, make it new The idea being, of course, that succession of isms that we all know, cubism, futurism, fauvism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And each one was supposed to be a step in the progression. And it's a little bit like, Apple bringing out its new products every 2 years. So there's this kind of underlying parallel between art as problem solving and industry, which artists didn't like to acknowledge at the time. But nevertheless, they were working with the same mechanism. Well, that was the ideal version of it, that it would be like constantly improved Apple products. In practice, it was sometimes a little bit like airplane food, They keep changing it, but it doesn't get any better. But this is just a little reminder. This is just like 24 art movements from the West, which this is nowhere near 1,000 years worth. This is just a few years worth. And what's interesting, of course, is that if you read each of those in turn, you have to think about a very different technique. But more than that, you have to think about a very different worldview. I mean, each and every one of these has different premises, different techniques, and different sensibilities. And that's what we're accustomed to. By the same token, the idea of emptiness versus fullness. Here you have a mountain scene, which is essentially half not there, right? I think if you did a mathematical calculation of the amount of the picture plane which is actually covered with medium as opposed to the amount that's there, would come out just about even. And the idea being that the emptiness provides room for contemplation and for the viewer to fill in and engage, etc. But it's very different from the Western approach. I mean, this is a death scene. Even a death scene in the West is full of stuff and incident and movement, right? And it doesn't even have to be, even our abstract art tends to be like this. It's almost as like this is a snapshot of the psyche, flatness versus volume and perspective. So here's a portrait from the 16th century where you do have sort of implication of depth, right? Certain things like beard overlays, the collar, and there's some indications around the eyes that gives you a sense of a little bit of receding space. But essentially, it's a flat pattern, as opposed to portraiture of the West, where one uses modeling and chiaroscuro and perspective to create something approximating an actual living presence. So it's sort of the difference between sign and incarnation in a way. Or here, this beautiful pattern of I guess male and female horsemen, horse people. Very beautiful, but also very flat, as opposed to, say, Caravaggio, where you have this dramatic, almost one-point perspective and the drastic lighting differences. Someone once pointed out to me, it's ironic that if you made a list of maybe the 100 most beautiful images in the Western canon, one of them would be of a horse's ass. And very much in the same vein, subtlety versus boldness. Here's a beautiful example about the properties of water, which is about suggestiveness and flow and indeterminacy. There, where does the water end and the mist begin, as opposed to the Western approach. It's literally in your face or in the side of the head in this case. Or to put it another way, essence versus appearance. A lotus presented in the Asian tradition is not about the way the lotus actually looks to the eye. It's about how the lotus exists in the mind eternally, as opposed to the Western approach, which is about reproducing the perceptual experience of the golden, at least the flowers. Ironically, they both have sort of the same theme. I mean, they're both about the ephemeral nature of life, right? The coming and going, natural phenomena, including ourselves. And then we get to the most puzzling thing of all for a Westerner, calligraphy. We have paintings with text, but it's not the same as calligraphy. Because I'm told, and again, I'm not an expert, when one looks at calligraphy, what you're looking at is the brushwork and what it tells you about the flow of energy, the artist's touch, the speed or slowness, the fleeting quality or the sturdy quality, et cetera, and that is the point of the experience, as opposed to the Western use of text, where the words are essential to convey some meaning. Now, everybody knows this image, right? And we all know the joke, this is not a pipe. But I guarantee you no one remembers that the words are in cursive. Whereas in calligraphy, that would be the whole point. And then, of course, we have this major difference in distribution of art, or we're used to, which was a tradition-based master and apprentice system where copying, for example, was a very important and very valid artistic discipline, as opposed to the Western market where you were supposed to sell the proof of your originality, right? So if we look at the situation today, these are the figures from last year. You'll see that the U.S. is twice the size of the Chinese market now. There was a time when the Chinese market was larger, when it was the largest. But if you go around that wheel, you'll notice that China is the only Asian country that even registers. All the rest of Asia is lumped in there with the rest of the world, which means each country in Asia accounts for less than 1% of the market. And if you total up the other figures, it means that the Western world, and Western art, accounts for 70-30% of the market. Which reminds me of something that often happens. Every critic, every magazine person encounters this experience. You go various places, giving talks and meeting people, and artists come up to you and they start asking questions. And the questions take various forms, but very quickly you realize that the real underlying question is, how can I get a show in New York? So a few years ago, as a joke, I gave a lecture in Korea in which I said, you know how they say in China that Mao is 70% correct and 30% wrong? I think the secret to breaking into the Western market for an Asian artist is to make your work 70% Western or global contemporary and 30% Asian. To my chagrin, I looked out at the audience and saw people, doodling. And I wish I could be more encouraging at this moment. But this, after all, is a moment of neo-nationalism. Yes. Where we have President Xi probably for life, and President Trump maybe for the rest of our lives. He may kill us all. So like Lilly, I like to believe that this is only a temporary situation, that in the long run, we are still moving towards globalism and a greater world unity. But we have to get through this phase first. Very much.
That you laid out for us, Richard, about Eastern art and the Western viewer. And it definitely resonates with something Lilly said about derivative. And this idea of art as derivative. Now, I wasn't there at the Magicien de la Terre in '89, but I did see in 1990 one of the first exhibitions of contemporary African art at the Studio Museum in Harlem. And read a review by Rosalind Krauss at the time, who was basically saying, she was trashing it, and she said this is third-rate modernism, right? And it struck me, because I saw it with an African art class, that she just didn't understand what they were doing. That she was looking at it from her perspective of like, if I were going to a gallery in New York and I saw this art, this is what I would think. As opposed to that sort of jump that you'd have to make in order to understand what the African artist thought they were doing. And so that's what I wanted to ask all of you in terms of how does that dynamic between being an original artist, which is something we value in the West, and being an authentic artist, which is something clearly, around cultural nationalism as you spoke, how does an artist overcome that jump if they're coming from China or indeed any other Asian country? 30%. But also as critics, right, how do you overcome this question of what your own, package is, what your own cultural bias is, of course, but also how do you sort of attend to or work that so that you don't get stuck in that trap?
I don't know. When I did a book on Chinese art years ago, I tried to be very clear at every
moment that this is the view from a Western critic. This is largely how it appears to us. However, I also made an effort to see the same work through Chinese eyes, which meant trying to educate myself in the history, in the current cultural circumstances, in the intellectual presuppositions, etc. Can you ever do that perfectly? I don't think so. If you're not born and raised in a particular culture.
Can't really hear you.
Okay. Can you hear that?
Maybe the system's gone down again.
Yes, it's not working.
It's not working.
Okay. Here. That's
Does this work?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. I got it.
You got your work.
I don't know if you heard that. I was saying that, I try to do two things. One is to present the view clearly as a Western person and say, this is how it appears to us. But at the same time, to also have moments where you say, well, but how does it appear in its own context? How does it appear in Western, Chinese eyes? And to do that, you have to educate yourself in the history, in the current social circumstances, in the intellectual presuppositions, etc. And you can never do that perfectly, right? So I think just candor is key. Just admitting, I'm doing the best I can here, folks. and when I get it wrong, tell me.
But then maybe we can look at it another way, which is that we can't, as I said, what you see is what you see. So we can only see it within our own limitations, and that's for everyone. So even as a critic that actually looks at a lot of work, I'm a generalist, as I said, and I don't look only at Chinese work, and I don't think that, because I don't have whatever, verticality in some ways, but I do have horizontality and a kind of basis for comparison. So I think we understand it's subjective. I think anyone here understands that we are doing this subjectively and that we are doing it fluidly, because I think we also change our minds. So I think all of that exists, and that when we look at a work, I don't think it's ever definitive what we see. I don't know that we can actually put ourselves into someone else's culture. I mean, as you said, we try. We try not to be too much too much. What's the word? Yahoo. but we do. We are by the very nature of it limited. But within that, you try. We all. I think everyone here understands that we are sort of subjectivized, and
I don't believe in the idea of the derivative, except perhaps in the context of an amateur artist who's trying to emulate some artist that they desire to emulate for some reason. And I would cite going back to Modernism, perhaps through the 20s up through the 50s and 60s internationally. You can go to India, you can go to Singapore, you can go to Canada, you can go to Australia, and you can look at the work, and stylistically you might think that this work is derivative of the great European modern masters, but when you start to look at the content, which is actually much more important, the content is it's different, and it is more related to the local context. And many of those artists may have gone and studied in Europe, but I think that it is just as valid as any modern European art, and modernism has dropped down in different parts of the world at different times. So if it comes 20 years later, it doesn't really matter.
Thank you. I think that's a great view. My own feeling is that we have to try to interrogate what modernism are we looking at, and sort of how are the conditions for modernism distinct in these worlds. But it is, I think, one of the fundamental challenges of criticism to try to address, and I think it is also extremely important that we do try to address things that are not ours. Corinne talked about getting out of our comfort zone, right? And that is something which is necessary in order to prevent that sort of neo-nationalism moment, right? If we draw back and say, no, this is what I know, this is what I'm going to write about, then we end up stuck with that problem. Okay, back being moderator. I'm interested in the idea of a couple of things that came up. One was which is, Lilly mentioned the Asia Art Archives, but also something that you said, Keith, about the way in which you want your journal to exist for future historians of Chinese art. And that you want to give them a platform. So I wonder about the difference between writing and temporality in terms of criticism and in terms of immediacy, and then how those immediate moments add up to history, and how we start to understand that. At what point do we understand?
Well, it may take some time. I don't know. I don't know quite how to answer that. It's just that it's more a subliminal thing. If you're writing, like, are you writing for now, the moment, or are you writing thinking about the future at the same time? And it's not that you're trying to predict anything about the future, but it's like in the back of your consciousness is what you're writing. Is it going to have a place in the future? And you know, the histories that I talk about and the Yishu deals with are maybe not the mainstream histories, but I think they're important histories nonetheless. And we feel that we are some kind of chronicle of history. We're not a comprehensive chronicle of history, but we insert certain aspects of cultural production into history.
I'd just like to say that I do like the way that you presented how Yishu approaches things. I think that's, very commendable. And just very briefly, I would say that the future will read it the way it wants to. We cannot predict that.
Okay, that's fantastic. So many questions. So translation is an issue that comes up, and I don't want to go back into the same question I just asked about derivatives. It's a slightly different issue, right? But how do we think about translation? And particularly because critics are translators of another language just to start, right? We're talking about taking visual language and turning it into verbal language, or written language, actually. So that's already a process of translation. How does that combine with the process of cultural translation?
Are you talking about written?
Yeah, writing criticism.
Well, we deal with a lot of translations, and I have to tell you, I've cried. Like, through them and trying to understand them. And there are situations, in fact, in my upcoming issue, we've got a situation with the title, and we've been dealing with how to translate the title because there is no English translation. So I've been in situations where we have this phrase from Chinese, and if we try and put it into perfect English, it makes no sense. But if we put it into imperfect English, then people understand that it's a translation and it cannot be properly translated.
Well, I think translation, perhaps, in the end, is its own creative act. As you said, because sometimes when it's an accurate translation, it reads like nonsense. So when you understand, and that means you have to have really good command of both the language you're translating into and the language it is in, and that's difficult. But if you do that well, then I think you serve everyone well. And if you don't, it can be a travesty. I mean, I sort of just quickly alluded to that when I was talking, but I read signage in places, in national museums elsewhere, and it's in English, and no one has vetted that translation. And it just does such a disservice to the artists. They just, it's laughable. I mean, I'm actually amused. It's like autocorrect, it comes up with fantastic things, but it's not what you want when you're the artist. So yes, I think it's critical. And as I said, I think look, English does not have to be the default language. It is at this moment. In fact, everyone I know in New York is taking Chinese. I mean, no matter what their kids at 2. But nonetheless, who knows when that's going to be the lingua franca. But that is important. That in this globe that I picture, I don't think I'm being that Pollyannish about it. I don't think that everyone will get on in this globe. I think just so that we can have access, that we're not artificially bounded. that I think is what we're looking for, not political risk constraints like gates we can't get through. But that, I just lost my train of thought. Where was I going? I had something, I had a point I wanted to make. Maybe it'll come to me.
Well, I'm lucky in that I don't in America we don't really do translations. But it's certainly an issue, and again, truth in advertising. I write a lot about Chinese art, but I don't speak Mandarin, and I don't read it. And I think it's very important to acknowledge that frequently, because, as we all know, language is more than a language; it's a total mindset. And if you don't have the language, you're never going to perfectly understand how that mentality really works. So you're always going to be making an approximation.
I just do want to add this one thing, which is it doesn't matter what language it is, but we need to have one language. So whatever it is, so we can communicate and write beautifully.
I think we're over time, but I do want to give the audience a chance to ask a question or two if we have some.
Yeah, first of all, thank you. All the presentations have been great. I wanted to take issue with your statistical approach, which Richard kind of underlined in the mention about the art auctions. In that, so where you made an eloquent case that we're inundated by information between the lines, but I think there's always a context to information and what questions you ask of it and what you're attempting. And I'm not talking about your biases, but when you all the auction figures, to me, neither of you mentioned the fact that there are European resale rights, and that's why there are very low auction totals in Munich, Paris, Berlin. To me, this is the important thing. Why is the U.S. not bought into this system of protecting artists? Or in the same way, when you talked about the content of art fairs, art fairs. To me, the interesting point seems to be the creation of art fairs and biennials that didn't exist a mere 20 years ago. So I feel like your contexts are lacking what are really the key historical questions. So.
Thank you for that. Because actually you sort of explain a lot of things that I explained in the book that didn't have time to explain today. I mean, the first piece, I quoted a piece of criticism I wrote called Misreading the Art Market, and one of the things one of the cases I make there is that, we look at the art market, we look at these auction figures. Auction figures, depending on who you ask, can be somewhere around 50% of the art market, a little less, maybe a little more. Honestly, we have no idea.
And were those American buyers who were buying twice as much art as anybody else? I mean,
it's not that they're American buyers.
On the phone?
It's not that they're American buyers. It's that the transaction happened at an American auction, right? And so we're not, one of the problems about data is that when we have a little bit of data, we think we know something, right? But actually, what often is true, and one of the big arguments I have about the market is that there's a huge section of the market that even, Claire McAndrew and all her great surveys and wisdom has never even touched, right? In other words, it's only about the sort of the self-congratulatory victors of the art market, right? The people who are already successful, who are selling the kind of art that is considered fine art or contemporary art, not the kind of art that you would if you went to Union Square in San Francisco, you could buy a lot of art that wouldn't make it into Claire McAndrew's numbers, right? And we have to acknowledge that this is the kind of art that most people actually buy. So what are we looking at here, right? You're absolutely right. There's a ton of context that we're missing. Resale rights is an issue. California actually has resale rights, but apparently they're never, artists aren't able to use them. So there's a lot of different complexities that can get flattened. Both in a data presentation, but also in a brief lecture, but these are all issues that I think we could be addressing more. There was a hand here. There was a hand in the back there before. I'll ask you.
I was intrigued by a couple of slides that really show I was intrigued by the 3 slides that really show the 3 abstract work, I think mostly paintings. It kind of intrigued me to ask you your views on the Chinese painting in general, from the perspective of that. I personally feel that being Chinese and being an artist myself, I have observed that I haven't really seen any really groundbreaking abstract painting that comes from Chinese artists. And these are the second, I would say, the only artist that I've seen that does that from China is Shanghai artist Zheng. And these were the 2, 3, 4 pieces that I've seen. And my observation really has been that most of the Chinese abstract paintings are not convincingly abstract in the sense that they all have, this seems to be the need to represent something. And that to me seems to be rooted in the language itself. The fact that Chinese is a pictorial language. In the end, we have this innate need, it seems to me we have the innate need to say the moon has to look like the moon, no matter how much the character has changed, as opposed to, say, English, the 3 letters N-double-N can stand in as the moon. So there's that leap of faith that as Chinese we cannot take this seems to be. So coming back to the 3 slides, even the last slide that was most impressive to me.
See the actual thing,
Oh, okay, so that might help.
They're in the gallery right now, at Nanhai Gallery.
Good, I'll go see it.
Yeah. So you should say that, and then we'll talk.
Okay.
No.
Even the last one, I just want to finish and then I want to hear your response to it. Even the last one, which is really impressive, that my first response was, wow, it looked familiar, and it immediately brought me to Rothko. And then I realized the differences and nuances and so on. And eventually, I still ended up with, it actually looked like a landscape. It's like a landscape, and there's a need to have a very bright band on the top. So that's how I approach the things. I just want to hear your actual opinion on it.
Well, some people don't think there's anything abstract ever. You can't put a line in a work without making a landscape. So, this could apply here also. I think you're talking about Shengtian's work, and I think that he does actually refer to landscape, and he also refers to abstraction, and to minimalism, and to Rothko. But I think also that, one of the things about painting abstractly, well, this is not about Chinese, painting abstractly, because I hadn't really thought that they didn't paint abstractly, or that wasn't, I didn't think that would be such an issue. But, I don't even know that right now, if we talk in a global context, and these artists do work in a global context, that needs to be a real discussion anymore, because I think we're accustomed to the fact that you can take all these languages and make a work of art, and that is its validity. So, but as I said, let's talk about it in front of the painting.
One last question.
Okay, last question. I saw a hand up over here before.
Yeah, probably not so easy to answer. First of all, Nanhai, great job. Panel, excellent, both panels. Really loved this event today. And you all have so much experience, but if you strip out markets and auction prices and just general price of art, with all of your experience, are you able to identify an artist and a body of work that 50 years from now is going to be something that is recognized as one of the great artists of our time?
Do you want to say no?
I was going to say I do that before breakfast every day. Okay, I think with that, we should convene downstairs and look at some art, right? Thank you so much.
All right, such an intense afternoon. So we have a reception downstairs, and I will once again want to thank each and every speakers. Each of every of them have been a great keynote speaker. Actually, in fact, they are. So very sorry to have to condense them in one section afternoon, but let's give them a round of applause. Thank you.
Hundreds.